You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 17.
After the sun sank below the mountains in the west, Burnmaster awoke and immediately checked his wristwatch. He had slept for almost 7 hours, and even though he felt refreshed, he was annoyed at himself for letting so much time slip through his fingers. Rising quickly from the bed, he pulled the curtains aside from the window and saw that the main street was growing dark as dusk settled over the town. The light from inside the shops and hotels that faced the street began to illuminate the night with their orange warmth, and high overhead the sky was changing to a deep azure filled with countless shimmering stars. He left his room and walked down the corridor, knocking on his companions' doors one at a time. The Koreans were staying in rooms that were further down the corridor. Burnmaster walked along the creaking wooden floor, stopped at Flattop's door and raised one hand to knock. But before he rapped his knuckles on the door, he paused and wondered if there was any need to wake them. He knew that the Koreans wanted to tag along with him while he searched for Nicky Zipster, but he would rather not have them follow him around. He still didn't entirely trust them. They may have saved his life, but that didn't endow them with permanent halos. But just as Burnmaster stepped away from the door, it opened abruptly to reveal the enormous bulk of Flattop. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, blocking out the light from inside his room and casting a shadow over Burnmaster like a solar eclipse. Flattop's small black eyes stared down at Burnmaster. "Time to go?" he asked. Burnmaster nodded and replied, "I've woken up everybody else." Then he noticed that Flattop was wearing a gray singlet. He tried not to look, but his eyes were drawn to the thick layer of shiny silver hair that covered the visible parts of Flattop's upper body. Burnmaster himself was pretty hairy by the standards of other men, but he had never seen body hair like this. From knuckle to shoulder, Flattop's enormous arms were covered in hair, particularly his forearms, so thick that it was almost like fur. Burnmaster was about to look away, but then he noticed something else. The proportions of Flattop's body were odd. It was unnoticeable when the giant Korean was wearing a coat, but now that he was wearing a singlet, Burnmaster saw that his arms were too long, and his upper body was too large in comparison with his legs. His knuckles seemed disproportionately large, and the skin on his hands looked unnaturally tough and leathery. Burnmaster stepped aside as Flattop crouched down and maneuvered his bulk through the narrow doorway. "I'll wake up Mohawk and Maine," he grunted. "We'll be ready when you are." As the giant Korean lumbered down the corridor, Burnmaster saw the thick tract of silver hair that ran from the top of Flattop's bare shoulders, down his spine and underneath the back of his singlet. Burnmaster had never seen anything like it, and when he turned away, a strange thought occurred to him. The silver hair, the body proportions, the leathery knuckles, they were all traits that he had seen countless times during his professional career as a zoologist. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he thought that Flattop had a number of physical characteristics that were just like a silverback gorilla. The idea was so ridiculous that he gave it no more thought. Further down the corridor, he heard somebody singing and the whoosh of running water from the showers, and by the time he had collected his soap and towel, he'd forgotten all about Flattop's oddly simian characteristics. 20 minutes later, everybody was assembled in the hotel foyer. They all looked freshly scrubbed, but Isabelle was suspicious about Flattop. She sniffed experimentally in his direction and decided that he probably hadn't showered at all. They were all hungry, and there were no arguments when Burnmaster suggested they begin searching for Nicky Zipster in the restaurant next door. After the meal, during which the giant Koreans consumed enough food to feed a small community for a week, Pemba accompanied Burnmaster to pay the bill and ask the restaurant owner if he had recently seen a woman matching Nicky Zipster's description. The problem was that it had been a long time since Burnmaster had seen Nicky, and he wasn't entirely sure what she looked like. 10 years ago, she had been a slim, attractive woman with long blonde hair and brown eyes. Other than the color of her eyes, it was entirely possible that she looked quite different now, and Burnmaster hoped, for reasons both related and unrelated to his search for her, that her appearance had not changed very much with the passage of time. The restaurant owner was a short, balding man wearing a stained apron over his round belly. Burnmaster paid the bill and included a generous tip to ensure he had his full attention. After explaining who he and his friends were, Burnmaster proceeded to describe Nicky's physical appearance and ask if he had seen her. As the restaurant owner spoke little English, Pemba translated what Burnmaster was saying. The restaurant owner crossed his arms over his belly, thought for a moment and then replied, a little apologetically, that he could not remember seeing a woman who matched that description. Back at the table, Isabelle asked the question on everybody's minds. "What did he say?" she asked. "He hasn't seen her," said Burnmaster, "but there are other restaurants in this town. Maybe Nicky didn't come to this one." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but there is no disappointment quite as poignant as the first. They left the restaurant and, standing in the cold night air on the street outside, discussed their plan of action. Somebody suggested that the search of Shabru would be faster if they split up, but Burnmaster was against the idea. He was the only person who knew what Nicky Zipster looked like, which meant she could walk right past everybody else and they wouldn't recognize her. Isabelle pointed out that there weren't likely to be many blonde-haired, brown-eyed women in Shabru, which Burnmaster agreed with, but he decided it was best if they all stuck together and searched from one end of the town to the other. Maine nodded in agreement. That approach suited him just fine. He actually knew what Nicky looked like because the camera he stole from her office in Kathmandu contained several photographs of a woman that he now believed to be her, based on Burnmaster's description. But he wasn't about to tell Burnmaster that. For the next hour, the group worked its way along one side of the main street, stopping at every shop and hotel to give the same description of Nicky and ask the same questions. The local people were friendly, though the sight of the silver-haired giants usually caused them to hesitate before answering. In Maine's mind, this confirmed that tagging along with the 14-year-olds had been the right decision. But Flattop grew increasingly frustrated with the whole process. Night had settled over the town, and some of the shops on the main street were closing before Burnmaster had had a chance to speak to the staff. Leaning towards Maine, Flattop muttered, "This is taking too long." Maine glanced at his brother. "Just be patient and stick with the plan," he replied. Flattop snorted loudly like a thoroughbred stallion, blasting a white cloud of condensation into the cold night air. "I ain't got time to be patient," he muttered. The search continued. Flattop insisted on following Burnmaster and Pemba into every shop and hotel so that he could listen to their conversation with the staff inside. He was concerned that the staff might mention some vital piece of information about the whereabouts of Nicky Zipster that Burnmaster would conveniently forget to pass on to him. Mohawk and Maine weren't concerned, though, and were content to wait outside with Gulbenkian and the 14-year-olds while Burnmaster and Pemba went inside and did the talking. Maine stared up at the night sky in silence, mesmerized by the beauty of the stars which, viewed from the high altitude of Shabru, shone like a million Christmas tree lights plugged into a nuclear power station. He wondered if the lens on Zipster's camera would allow him to capture the shimmering brilliance of the constellations. Isabelle noticed that Mohawk was listening to earphones that were plugged into an MP3 player. "What are you listening to?" she asked. Mohawk, seeing that she had asked him a question, took one earphone out of his ear while she asked the question again. "Music," he replied with a grin. "Of course, but what kind of music?" she asked. Mohawk's grin faded. Good question, he thought. He had no idea what kind of music was contained in the device because he had stolen it from Nicky Zipster's office back in Kathmandu. He hadn't had time to listen to all of the songs, and even if he had no idea what kind of music it was. Other than the names of the songs that were displayed on the small LCD screen, the only thing Mohawk knew about the music was that he liked it a lot. Maine glanced at Mohawk with a look that said, "Don't blow our cover story by talking about something you know nothing about." "Ooh, fast music with a, fast beat, like this," Mohawk replied, clicking his enormous fingers at a rapid but rhythmless pace. He gave her the MP3 player, and she put the earphones in her ears and started scrolling through the song list. Mohawk felt a pang of jealousy when he saw how easily her small thumb manipulated the buttons on the device. His huge thumb, which was perfectly suited to handling high-powered projectile weapons, was too large to operate the device with the same dexterity. "You've got a lot of stuff here," she said. "What's your favorite?" Mohawk liked every song he had heard on the device, but he couldn't name a single one. The one you're listening to now," he replied. She took the earphones out of her ears and looked up at the silver-haired giant. "Did you download all this stuff from the internet or get it pre-installed on the MP3 player when you bought it?" she queried carefully. Mohawk hesitated. He had no idea what the correct answer was, and he wondered if the origin of the music was obvious to Isabelle when she was looking at the song list on the device. Once again, he had no choice but to take a guess. "Pre-installed," he replied with what he hoped was a nonchalant shrug. It was a lot easier than downloading it all. What Mohawk didn't know was that there was no such thing as pre-installed music on an MP3 player. But the 14-year-olds knew, and Isabelle's question, which had been asked on a spur-of-the-moment hunch, had revealed that the Korean knew nothing about the MP3 player he claimed to own. And if he didn't know anything about the MP3 player, he was probably lying about where he got it too. Isabelle wondered why he would do that. She exchanged a brief glance with Laheeti and Twig and saw that they were thinking the same thing. Yeah, she replied quietly and handed the MP3 player up to him. Pre-installed is a lot easier. Mohawk grinned at her and then popped the earphones back in his ears and turned up the volume for the next song. When Burnmaster and Pemba finished one side of the main street, they crossed to the other side and started on the shops and hotels there. Another hour passed without success. Most of the shops were closed now, and soon they came to a hotel on the outskirts of Shabrubesi. Burnmaster, Pemba and Flattop went inside, only to emerge a few minutes later with glum expressions. Nothing, asked Isabelle. Burnmaster nodded. Laheeti, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets, shivered in the cold. That's the last hotel, isn't it? He asked. The main street leading out of the town went past the hotel and disappeared into the inky blackness of the wilderness. To Laheeti, the Himalayan night looked like a black ocean tide slowly flooding down the silhouetted mountains into Shabrubesi. It was easy to believe there were thousands of kilometers of uninhabitable terrain in that direction. There's no more hotels out there, that's for sure, Burnmaster said. We'll be able to ask at some of these shops when they open tomorrow. I'm not holding out any hopes, though. We've asked at all the hotels. Doesn't seem like Nikki stayed at any of them. So where to from here? Asked Isabelle. The mountains. It would be pointless, not to mention dangerous, to go blundering around in Langtang without some idea of where she went climbing, explained Burnmaster. We could search for decades and never find her. I agree, added Pemba quickly. The mountains are the last place we should go to find Nikki. In fact, we should probably never go there. He couldn't think of anything worse than following Burnmaster and his companions around in the Himalayas. Better for them to stay in the relative safety of Shabrubesi and the nearby towns. Isabelle frowned at Pemba's constant negativity and waited to see if Burnmaster contradicted the disagreeable Nepalese boy. But he just nodded and continued, I think the best idea is to finish checking the shops tomorrow morning and then head into the next town and start asking questions there. Somebody must have seen Nikki. It wasn't so long ago that she came through this area, so Laheeti's attention had drifted from the conversation. Peering into the gloom, his sharp eyes picked out a flicker of movement in the distance. He watched carefully, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. What's that? He asked, pointing into the dark. Burnmaster stopped talking and stared into the dark. Everybody else did the same. I don't see anything, Isabelle said. Neither do I, said Twig. Mane narrowed his black eyes. I do. So do I, added Mohawk. The GX's genetically enhanced eyesight was superior to everybody else's. What about you, Flattop? He asked. Yeah, I see 'em, he grunted. Two people coming slowly towards us. They look pretty busted up, like they've been in a fight. As soon as Burnmaster heard that, he hurried forward. His first thought was that it might be Nikki. Then two dark forms stumbled out of the night in front of him, and he realized that they were two men with thick, brown beards. Flattop was right. They looked as though they had been dragged down a mountain, face first. Their clothes were torn, and one man was limping badly and being supported by the other. The injured man's leg had a makeshift splint wrapped around it, made from a sleeping mat tied tightly around the calf and knee using what looked like shoelaces. Their faces were cut and swollen, their lips cracked. Burnmaster had enough experience as a climber to know that these men had been to hell and back and were in that halfway house between life and death now. The injured man was only barely conscious, but the other man, when he saw Burnmaster emerge from the dark in front of him, groaned, "Help us, please help us." Burnmaster immediately took the injured man's weight onto his own shoulders. Free of the burden, the other man slumped down on the stony ground and struggled out of the straps on his muddy rucksack, laughing and sobbing at the same time. Burnmaster turned and yelled for Mane to bring the torch quickly. Flattop put a restraining hand on his brother's arm. "This isn't our concern," he muttered. "Let's not make the same mistake we made at the landslide." Mane looked at Flattop's hand and then into his black eyes. "That wasn't a mistake," he grunted, "and neither is this." He pushed past Flattop and lumbered into the darkness, the bright yellow beam of his torch dancing around as he ran. When he was standing beside Burnmaster, he shone the torchlight on the limping man's leg, but the extent of the injuries was hidden beneath the makeshift splint. The other man stared up at the silver-haired giant in surprise. "We need to get them to someplace warm," Mane said. "Let's get them back to the hotel," said Burnmaster. "I've got a first aid kit in my pack. It's basic, but it's a start." Indicating the injured man with a shake of his head, he said, "How about you carry him and I'll help the other man?" Maine agreed, and gently wrapping his huge hands around the injured man's ribcage beneath his arms, he lifted him off the ground like an adult picking up a small child. The man's head lolled to the side and his eyes flickered open briefly before closing again. Burnmaster turned to the man sitting on the ground and asked, "Can you walk?" "Yeah, I can walk," he replied, but when he stood up his legs buckled and Burnmaster caught him before he fell backwards. Putting one arm over Burnmaster's shoulder, he smiled half-heartedly. "On second thought, maybe I could use some help," he said. His accent was American. As they hobbled forward, he introduced himself as John and his friend Sam. Isabelle, Laheeti, Twig, Gull and Pemba ran after Maine, leaving Mohawk and Flattop standing together at the edge of the orange light coming from the windows of the last hotel on the outskirts of the town. Twig stared at the two bearded men in shock. "What happened to you guys?" he exclaimed. "It's a long story, kid," John sighed. He seemed so exhausted that even speaking was difficult. Burnmaster asked Twig to carry the man's rucksack, and the islander boy ran back to get it, then hurried along beside Maine and the injured man. The sight of civilization seemed to invigorate John, and as Burnmaster helped him along the street, he started to talk about what had happened. Burnmaster had already guessed most of the details just by looking at the poor physical condition of the pair, but he listened to John's story without interrupting. His only concern was that John would say something that would frighten the 14-year-olds. He had warned them about the dangers of the Himalayas on several occasions, but there was a world of difference between hearing about the horrible consequences of a climbing trip gone wrong and actually seeing two climbers with a shopping list of injuries stumble into town on the brink of death. John started to explain the unfortunate sequence of mishaps and misfortune that had struck he and Sam on the mountain. After scaling the peak of an enormous granite pyramid and starting back down, Sam lost his footing and tumbled about 7 meters, eventually skidding to a stop on a small shelf of rock. By the time John had clambered down beside his friend, there was little doubt in Sam's mind that his leg was broken. From that moment on, death shadowed their every move. They were lost, running low on food and water, and Sam was badly injured and unable to walk down a flight of stairs, let alone descend all the way down the mountain. "So how did you get down the mountain?" asked Isabelle. "With great difficulty," croaked John, and he went on to describe how he slowly, carefully carried Sam through the blizzard, still completely lost, hoping that they would stumble across a group of climbers who could help them. But they had moved so far off the established trekking trails that they saw nobody, and even after the storm passed and the sun shone brightly in a clear blue sky, it still took them several days to get their bearings and head in the direction of civilization. Flattop had drifted back, tugging on Mohawk's sleeve to indicate that he wanted to talk. Burnmaster and the others continued on, listening intently to John's tale, unaware that Flattop and Mohawk were no longer walking beside them. "Why are we helping these two men?" asked Flattop. "Because they clearly need help," replied Mohawk. "You saw them. They're almost dead." Flattop snorted. "So what? It's not our concern," he snarled. "I don't get this fascination with helping complete strangers. You don't think one day you'll need a stranger to help you?" asked Mohawk. "Help me do what? Climb down a mountain carrying a man with a broken leg?" scoffed Flattop. "I don't think so. I mean," that right there was John's mistake. What an idiot. When the other guy broke his leg, John should have dumped him on the mountain and climbed down alone. That would have been the smart thing to do. After all, it was the other guy's fault. It was his leg that was broken. If he was a better climber, he wouldn't have broken it. He deserved to get left on the mountain. Mohawk shook his head, marveling that his brother's heart was colder than the Himalayan mountain air. "Instead," continued Flattop, "John tried to get down the mountain carrying the other guy on his back. What a fool. He might have killed himself. And for what? So the other guy can flutter his weakling eyelids open and utter a pathetic thank you. Talk about twisted priorities, and now we're wasting our time helping them both." Mohawk noticed that his brother's gravelly voice had become an angry growl. "Hey, keep it down or they'll hear you," he whispered. "So what?" Flattop snapped back. "I don't care what they think. In fact, I should go and tell them all what idiots they are. Would be the best advice they ever got." Mohawk glanced at his brother. "That's not a very good idea," he replied. "For one thing, I don't think that's what Korean university students would do, and if we behave out of character, it will blow our cover story." "This cover story is more trouble than it's worth," grunted Flattop. "Helping Burnmaster ended up being a good idea, right?" continued Mohawk. "It got us into Burnmaster's posse and onto the trail of Nicky Zipster and the Yeti Tooth." "What trail?" muttered Flattop. "She's not here and neither is the Tooth. We should be moving on to the next town right now, not wasting our time helping these two pathetic strangers. It's not our job to help every hard luck case we come across. People who waste their time helping the weak become weak themselves. They lose focus on what's really important. It's like a sickness, and it's contagious. Then he stared at Mohawk with a determined expression on his face. Just between you and me, Maine's infected, he spat. Infected with a disease that makes people think that helping complete strangers is a good idea. You and me, he growled, beating one bowling ball-sized fist against his own chest, have got to keep our heads clear and make sure we stay focused on the mission. He paused, his gaze searching Mohawk's stony face, and then continued. Even if it means cutting Maine loose. That comment caused Mohawk to look sharply at Flattop. It was the first time he had ever heard either of his brothers suggest that one should be left behind. Mohawk's first memories were of his brothers, and the thought of being without one of them was too strange to contemplate. Every single day of training in the North Korean military had been undertaken as a team. They had until now functioned together perfectly. He understood Flattop's devotion to the mission, but the idea that his brother would split up their family filled him with shock. We're stronger together than we are apart, Mohawk said. If there's a rift in our team, let's fix it, instead of talking about cutting one of us loose. What if it can't be fixed? Flattop asked darkly. What if the mission is doomed to fail? It's not doomed to fail, Mohawk replied, shaking his head. His vertical silver grill of hair wavered like long grass in the wind. Flattop gripped his brother's arm fiercely and hissed, what if it comes down to a choice between Maine or the mission? Mohawk stopped and met his brother's intense stare. The only way to complete this mission, he replied, is to stay together. If we split up, we fail. Mohawk was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. He did believe that only together could they complete the mission, but he failed to mention that his own motivation to return to North Korea was crumbling as quickly as Maine's. The military brainwashing that ensured Flattop's continued obedience had not had the same effect on Mohawk or Maine. Their minds had broken free, revealing their newfound humanity in a way that Flattop simply couldn't understand. A gulf had opened up between Flattop and his brothers, and it was going to fracture the team in two. Mohawk was saddened by that thought, but their destiny seemed inevitable. Soon there would be war between Maine and Flattop. And when it happened, Mohawk knew which brother he would side with. Flattop let go of Mohawk's arm and grunted. We'll see. Up ahead, Isabelle ran forward and held the hotel door open. Maine carried the injured climber through the foyer, heading towards the hallway that led to their rooms. Bring him over here and put him on the rug, Burnmaster said. I need to examine his injuries, and there's more light here than in the rooms. Pemba and the 14-year-olds moved into the foyer as Maine gently laid Sam, who was now in a deep sleep, on one of the faded rugs. The manager, seeing an unconscious man with muddy clothes and a makeshift splint on one leg lying on the floor of his hotel, hurried out from behind his desk and jabbered rapidly at Burnmaster and Maine in a foreign language, at which point Pemba intervened. After listening to Pemba's explanation, the manager looked slightly less agitated, but a permanent look of concern creased his features. Twigger fetched a bottle of water for John, who gently poured some into Sam's cracked, unmoving lips before he himself drank thirstily. Mohawk and Flattop drifted into the foyer a couple of minutes later, but nobody noticed. Burnmaster was crouched beside Sam's prostrate form, gently cutting the black laces off the makeshift splint with his pocket knife. When the last lace popped off, he folded the blade away and carefully removed the sleeping mat, revealing a trouser leg stained with dried blood from the knee to the ankle. Without taking his eyes off the leg, he asked Isabelle to go and get the first aid kit from his rucksack. When she returned, he was unlacing the man's hiking boots, slipping them off one at a time. Opening the kit, he withdrew a pair of scissors and started to cut the fabric from the ankle upwards. I'm hoping this blood is from some kind of superficial cut on his leg, but it's probably more serious than that, he said. You kids sure you want to see this? Isabelle was wondering the same thing. The leg didn't look too bad when it was wrapped up in the sleeping mat, but now the trousers looked awfully bloody, and she suspected the man's leg was totally gross. She glanced at Laheeti and Twig. They weren't looking away, so she wasn't going to either. Burnmaster didn't wait for an answer. When he finished cutting the trouser leg up the middle, he folded the fabric back to reveal an injury that Isabelle would never forget. The man's shin was purple, swollen, deformed, covered in blood, and a small piece of bone jutted through the skin. To Isabelle's eyes, it was a leg so alien and disgusting that it couldn't belong to any normal person's body. She put her hand over her mouth, and this time she turned away. If Burnmaster was affected by what he saw, he didn't show it. After peering at the exterior of the wound, he gently ran his fingertips down the sides of the leg, trying to establish in how many places the bone was broken and the extent of the swelling. He looked up at Maine, who, still standing, towered over him. "I'm going to wash my hands, then reset this bone and resplint the leg," he explained. "I'll need your help to straighten out the leg while I do that." "Have you ever done anything like that before?" Maine had, because his military training included battlefield first aid, but he had no intention of telling Burnmaster that. He had seen plenty of blood in his lifetime, and this particular leg injury was all in a day's work back in North Korea. He swallowed a fake lump in his throat and tried to look squeamish. "No, but I think I can do it," he gulped. Burnmaster went to find some soap and water, and when he returned, he set to work. While Maine applied a gentle traction holding the ankle, Burnmaster massaged the end of the bone back into place. With that grisly task complete, he cleaned the area as best he could using antiseptic and then wrapped it in sterile bandages. "That's about the best I can do for now," he said, examining his handiwork. "The biggest problem at the moment is the infection." He rummaged through the first aid kit, found a bubble pack of antibiotics and gave it to John. "4 of these every day until he gets to hospital," he explained. "Starting as soon as he wakes up." Then he found some painkillers and handed them over. "These will help with the pain," he continued. "No more than 3 per day, but less if you can. There aren't very many in that pack, so when you run out, that's it." Burnmaster took off Sam's socks and gloves and checked his fingers and toes one at a time. "He doesn't seem to have any frostbite, which is good," he mused. After slipping the gloves and socks back on to make sure Sam's extremities stayed warm, he asked Maine to carry Sam up to Burnmaster's own room and cover him in blankets on the bed. Pemba would sort out a new room for Burnmaster later. Maine carefully picked Sam up and lumbered down the hallway. Flattop watched him go and was disgusted that a highly skilled commando like Maine had been reduced to a mere gopher nurse. His expression of disgust became one of satisfaction as he imagined the disparaging comments about Maine's performance that would appear in his next report to his masters in North Korea. As soon as he found an internet cafe, that report would be on its way. Burnmaster turned his attention to John. "Better check your fingers and toes, too," he said. John sat down on a chair and took his boots and socks off. Burnmaster looked at his toes and declared them all clear. But when John took his gloves off, Burnmaster found 2 fingertips on his left hand were hard and waxy, with a whitish appearance, a sure sign that those digits were in the early stages of frostbite. Burnmaster asked Pemba to heat some water, which the Nepalese boy did, returning a few minutes later with an old ceramic bowl half filled. Isabelle watched as John immersed his left hand. "I thought frostbite was really bad, but if all you have to do to fix it is put it in warm water, it can't be that bad," she said. "Most of the time there's nothing you can do, but in this case we've caught the frostbite early enough to try and rewarm the fingers," replied Burnmaster. He considered adding that another night in the mountains and John's fingers would have turned black and become candidates for immediate amputation, but he figured John didn't need to hear that. The process of rewarming the affected fingers was painful and John's face grew strained. He took off his beanie, revealing beads of sweat on his forehead. The shock of blonde hair and the pale skin under the beanie contrasted with the bright red sunburn on his nose and cheeks. Burnmaster tried to take John's mind off the pain by asking him if it was his first trip to Nepal. John explained that he and Sam had climbed to over 6,000 meters on Everest and Annapurna and had expected the climbing in Langtang National Park to be easier. "I had no idea the weather could turn so bad so fast," he said. "Yeah, this time of year blizzards can come from nowhere," Burnmaster agreed, thinking that any climb he and his companions attempted would be equally dangerous. His one consolation was that he understood the dangers and so could prepare for them, whereas John and Sam were relatively inexperienced climbers, and it was their lack of preparation that had almost killed them, not the bad weather or Sam's injury. John gritted his teeth as a new wave of pain lanced through his submerged fingers. "I hope the lady we trekked in with got out before the blizzard hit," he remarked. It took a moment for the comment to fully register in Burnmaster's mind. "You trekked in with a lady?" he asked absently. "Yeah, we met her in Thuloshabru a few kilometers down the road from here," John explained. "She was traveling alone, and seeing as we were all heading into Langtang, we decided to trek in together. We parted company with her after about 4 days and she continued further east." He winced again, looking at his fingers. "Anyway, I hope she turned around and got out before the bad weather hit," he said. He now had Burnmaster's undivided attention. "Where was she from?" he asked carefully. She was British, John said, but she said she'd been living in Kathmandu for a couple of years, could speak some Nepali too. I think she said she was a lecturer at Kathmandu University. Burnmaster didn't blink. What was her name? He asked. John frowned for a moment, thinking. Zipster, Nikki Zipster, he replied. Yeah, that was it. Then he noticed everybody was staring at him intently. Flattop had moved forward and was now near the front of the group, eyeballing John the way a hungry lion eyes its prey. Looking from face to face, John asked, "Why, do you know her?" "You could say that," Isabelle replied.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.